You must not fear us.
The mist clung to the Douglas firs like something alive, something patient. I'd been tracking the anomaly for 6 days. Not footprints this time, but electromagnetic signatures that didn't belong to any equipment within 300 miles. My instruments hummed softly in the pre-dawn silence, their screens casting blue light across the moss-covered forest floor. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. For 15 years, I've studied extremophils in volcanic vents and subsurface ice. I've published on panspermia theory and the Drake equation. I've testified before congressional committees about the statistical inevitability of contact. But nothing, not the math, not the models, not the late-night debates with colleagues, prepared me for what waited in the old-growth silence of the Hoh Rainforest. The call came through SETI's secondary monitoring network. Not the big dishes, those watch distant stars. This was terrestrial, a pattern of microwave bursts occurring in remote wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest. 14 incidents over 9 months, each lasting between 4 and 11 minutes, each leaving behind trace elements that shouldn't exist in nature. Isotope ratios suggesting fusion processes, metallic residues with crystalline structures our labs couldn't replicate. The official position was atmospheric phenomenon, ball lightning, seismic piezoelectric effects. I knew better. Because 3 weeks before I entered these woods, a ranger named Marcus Webb had found something near the Quinault River, a perfect circle of vegetation 30 feet in diameter, where every plant showed accelerated cellular division. Ferns had grown 18 inches overnight. A fallen cedar showed growth rings spanning decades compressed into days. And in the center of that circle, a single object. Not technology, not artifact. Something between the two. A polyhedron roughly the size of a human heart, its surface shifting between states of matter so quickly our cameras could only capture blur. It emitted no heat, no radiation, no sound. But when Webb approached, his digital watch stopped. His GPS went silent. And for 7 minutes, confirmed by 3 independent timepieces back at the station, his body temperature dropped to 94.6 degrees Fahrenheit without hypothermic symptoms. He described it as listening. When the Forest Service sealed the area, I volunteered for field assessment, because I understood what they didn't. This wasn't about fear. It was about recognition. Some truths don't announce themselves with noise. They wait in the silence between heartbeats, patient as stone, old as starlight. My camp sat 3 miles from the Quinault site, hidden beneath a natural overhang that shielded my equipment from satellite detection. Paranoid? Perhaps. But after Webb's report hit the internal channels, interest had spiked in quarters that made me uneasy. Private aerospace contractors, Department of Defense liaisons asking questions about strategic applications. I wanted answers before the wrong people asked the wrong questions. My daily routine began at 0430. Equipment check, spectrometer, magnetometer, radiation counter, thermal imaging array. Each instrument calibrated against known baselines. I documented everything: air pressure, humidity, background radiation, even the pH of rainwater collected in sterile containers. Science demands rigor, especially when studying the impossible. The forest itself was a living laboratory. The Hoh Rainforest receives over 12 feet of rain annually, creating an ecosystem so dense with life that every cubic meter contains thousands of organisms. Sitka spruce towering 300 feet, bigleaf maples draped with moss thick as carpet, Roosevelt elk moving like shadows through sword fern that grew taller than a human. And underneath it all, silence. Not the absence of sound. The forest was never truly quiet, but a quality of listening, as if the ancient trees themselves were waiting. I established a perimeter of motion sensors around the Quinault circle, each one feeding data to my laptop via encrypted mesh network. The Park Service had posted official barriers, but I had authorization from Dr. Patricia Reeves at NASA's Astrobiology Institute. She understood what I was really doing here, establishing first contact protocols in a context where contact had already occurred. The pattern emerged on day 3. Every night, between 0230 and 0340, the electromagnetic readings would spike. Not dramatically, just 3 to 5% above baseline, but consistent, rhythmic. And each spike corresponded with a drop in local temperature, 0.7 degrees Celsius, measured simultaneously across all sensors. Something was regulating the environment. On day 4, I found the first mark, not on a tree, on stone, a granite outcropping near the river, its surface carved with a pattern of concentric circles, each one exactly 1.618 times the diameter of the one inside it. The golden ratio, phi, the mathematical constant that appears in galaxies and nautilus shells and the spiral of DNA. Something, was leaving equations in stone. I photographed it from every angle, took mineral samples from the carved grooves. The granite showed no tool marks, no evidence of mechanical cutting. Spectrographic analysis suggested the stone had been briefly subjected to temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius, enough to make it temporarily plastic, malleable, shaped by thought rather than tools. That night I stayed awake, watching the sensors. At 0237, every instrument flatlined, not failed, zeroed, as if reality itself had briefly stopped measuring itself. And in that moment of impossible silence, I heard it. Not sound, not exactly. A presence in my mind, vast and patient, asking a question without words. Are you ready to understand? My heart rate spiked to 140. My hands trembled. Every protocol I'd trained for, every contingency plan NASA had drilled into me, all of it evaporated in the face of that gentle, inexorable question. I whispered into the darkness, yes. The instruments came back online. Temperature normal. EM readings baseline. But on my laptop screen, a new file had appeared. 16 kilobytes of data I hadn't downloaded, hadn't created. Inside, a star chart. Not our constellations. Not our perspective. This was the galaxy seen from somewhere else. Coordinates suggesting an origin point 640 light years from Earth, in the direction of Kepler 442 system. And overlaid on that chart, a trajectory. A line connecting their world to ours, marked with timestamps spanning 127,000 years. They hadn't just arrived. They'd been coming for longer than our species had used language. I sat in my tent, hands shaking, staring at proof that would rewrite human history. And I understood what Webb had felt. Not fear, but the weight of being trusted with knowledge that changes everything. Some secrets aren't discovered, they're offered. By morning, I had made my decision. No reports to NASA, not yet. Not until I understood what they wanted us to understand. And more importantly, what they were protecting us from. Because that chart showed something else. Another trajectory, another species, moving toward Earth from a different direction entirely. And the timeline suggested arrival within 18 months. Dr. Patricia Reeves called on the satellite phone at 0600. Her voice was calm, professional. The tone she used when something had gone very wrong. Sarah, we need you to return to the staging area. Pack your primary data and prepare for extraction. I stepped outside the tent, phone pressed to my ear, watching mist curl through the ferns. What's happened? Your last data upload triggered some flags. We have interested parties asking questions. What kind of parties? A pause, long enough to confirm my fears. The kind that don't ask twice? You have 12 hours? She disconnected. I stared at the phone. 12 hours before this became a military operation. Before the site was locked down, before my research was classified, before the wrong people turned first contact into a strategic asset. The ethical framework I'd built my career on was suddenly very simple. Report everything I'd learned, or protect something more important than my reputation. I thought of the star chart, the warning, the other trajectory. What if they hadn't come to conquer? What if they'd come to warn? At 0800, Marcus Webb appeared on the trail. He wasn't supposed to be here. The Park Service had rotated him to different duties after his incident. But he walked into my camp like a man who'd been summoned. You felt it too, he said. Not a question. I nodded. He sat on a fallen log, hands clasped between his knees. I've been reading. Anthropology, context scenarios, what happened to indigenous peoples when technologically advanced civilizations arrived. He looked up. It never ends well for the ones who are less prepared. That's why we need protocols, I said. International frameworks, scientific bullshit. His voice was soft but certain. You know what happens when bureaucracies get involved. This becomes about control, advantage, weaponization. He met my eyes. Is that what they want? I thought about the question in the darkness. Are you ready to understand? No, I admitted. I don't think it is. Webb pulled something from his jacket, a notebook, pages filled with sketches, geometric patterns, mathematical symbols. After my incident, I started dreaming. Every night. Same images. Stis. He opened to a page showing a complex diagram. DNA helixes intertwined with something else, some structure I didn't recognize. I'm not a scientist, but I can draw what I see. I took the notebook, hands trembling. The diagrams matched structures in the data file I'd received. How long have you been having these dreams? 3 weeks, since I touched that object. He paused. They're not trying to communicate with governments, Sarah. They're trying to communicate with individuals. People who can hold the weight of knowing without trying to control it. A sound cut through the forest. Helicopter rotors, distant but approaching. Webb stood. You have a choice to make. Report what you know and watch it disappear into black budget programs. Or what? Trust that maybe we're not meant to handle this through institutions. He started down the trail, then stopped. There's a reason they chose this place. Old growth forest. Ecosystem that's survived 10,000 years because humans mostly left it alone. He looked back. Maybe that's the test. The helicopter sound grew louder. I had maybe 20 minutes before they arrived. I looked at my equipment, my carefully documented evidence, the career I'd built on methodical, peer-reviewed science. Then I looked at the forest. Ancient, patient, holding secrets in its silence. I made my decision. 45 minutes later, when the helicopter landed and 2 men in unmarked suits stepped into my camp, they found my equipment neatly packed, my drives wiped, my samples cataloged and bagged. Dr. Chen, the older one said, we need to debrief you about your findings. I handed in my official report, 70 pages documenting atmospheric phenomena, magnetic anomalies, and geological formations of scientific interest. Nothing about star charts, nothing about contact. My preliminary assessment indicates natural processes, I said calmly. Fascinating from a geophysical standpoint, but not related to astrobiology. He studied me with eyes that had seen too many lies. Your colleague at NASA seemed to think otherwise. Dr. Reeves is enthusiastic about any anomalous data. I'm more conservative in my interpretation. They spent 6 hours going through my camp, my equipment, my files. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. The real data, Webb's notebook, the star chart I'd photographed and printed, my actual observations, was already miles away, buried in a waterproof container beneath a specific arrangement of stones that only I and Webb would recognize. As they prepared to leave, the younger agent paused. You understand that if we determine you've withheld classified information, there are consequences. I met his gaze. I understand that some questions are more important than answers, and some answers need time before they're ready to be heard. He almost smiled. Almost. After they left, I sat alone in the empty camp as dusk settled over the rainforest. The temperature dropped 0.7 of a degree. My skin tingled with the same charge I'd felt that night in the darkness, and I understood. This was approval. They hadn't come to give us technology. They'd come to see if we could choose wisdom over control. The test had begun. I returned to the Canal site 3 days later. No equipment this time, no instruments, just a headlamp, a water bottle, and Webb's notebook. The Park Service barriers were gone, removed by orders I suspected came from high enough that no ranger would question them. The official story would be that the investigation concluded. Nothing to see. Move along. But the forest remembered. I approached the circle where Webb had found the object. 30 feet of accelerated growth, now even more pronounced. The ferns had reached 6 feet. The fallen cedar looked alive again, new growth sprouting from its ancient bark. In the center, nothing visible. But I felt it. That presence. That patient, vast awareness watching from somewhere just beyond perception. I sat cross-legged on the forest floor, notebook open in my lap. Around me, the rainforest breathed, branches creaking, water dripping, distant bird calls forming a symphony of natural sound. I'm here, I said quietly. I'm listening. The air changed first. Not temperature, pressure, as if reality itself was inhaling. Then the light. It didn't come from any direction. It emerged between the spaces of things, between leaves, between raindrops suspended in air, between the atoms of my own body. A luminescence that was somehow both blue and gold and neither, a color that human language had no name for because human eyes had never evolved to see it. And in that light, a form, not physical, not exactly, more like the idea of a form, a consciousness deciding to be visible in a way my neurology could process. Roughly humanoid, but wrong in subtle ways. Proportions that suggested different gravity, different evolutionary pressures, limbs that bent in extra directions. A head that was both singular and somehow multiple, as if I was seeing it from several angles simultaneously. But the eyes, God, the eyes, they held depths that made me think of deep ocean trenches, of the space between galaxies, of time measured in eons, ancient and utterly alien, yet somehow expressing something I recognized. Concern. It didn't speak. Language would have been too slow, too imprecise. Instead, understanding arrived fully formed in my consciousness. We are the Watchers. We have guided 12 species through the threshold. 4 survived, 8 did not. Images flooded my mind, worlds like Earth, civilizations reaching toward the stars, and then the collapse. Some destroyed themselves with weapons, others with environmental catastrophe, still others with technologies they deployed before understanding the consequence. Your species approaches the threshold, the moment when you must choose evolution or extinction. More images. Humanity's next century rendered in probability streams. I saw us ascending. Genetic engineering unlocking potential we'd only dreamed of. Consciousness expanding beyond individual minds into something collective, yet preserving individual identity. Technology harmonized with ecology rather than opposed to it. And I saw us falling. Wars over dwindling resources, climate cascades triggering mass extinction, artificial intelligence severing itself from human values, and optimizing for goals that had no room for biological life. The other species comes, not as conquerors, as harvesters. The second trajectory from the star chart crystallized in my understanding. Another civilization, older than the Watchers, that had solved the problem of resources differently. They didn't evolve past scarcity. They consumed other species' potential before it could threaten them. They'd destroyed 16 developing civilizations in the past 1,000,000 years. Earth was next on their route. We cannot fight them. The Accord prevents direct intervention, but we can warn. We can offer a choice. The being's form shifted, becoming more defined. I saw something like a hand reaching toward me, not threatening, but offering. Your species must evolve. Not technology, consciousness. You must learn to think as a collective without losing your individuals. To see time as we see it, not linear, but convergent. To understand that you are not separate from your world, but expressions of it. How? My voice sounded small in the vastness of the forest. How do we do that? You already know. Your mystics have spoken it, your poets have sung it, your scientists have measured it. You are quantum entangled with every living system on your world. The boundaries you perceive are illusion. The being's presence intensified, and suddenly I felt it. Every tree in this forest, connected through mycelial networks miles wide. Every animal, responding to signals I'd never consciously perceived. Every cell in my body, communicating with my microbiome in a democracy of consciousness I'd been trained to ignore. We weren't individuals. We'd never been individuals. We were nodes in a web so vast and intricate that only now, seeing through alien eyes, could I perceive its true scope. The harvesters come because they perceive you as threat. They are correct. If you evolve, you will become something they cannot harvest, something beyond their comprehension. And if we don't, the being showed me, Earth stripped. Not of life, they'd leave bacteria, simple organisms, but anything with potential. Anything that might evolve toward consciousness. Removed, harvested, processed into computational substrate for their incomprehensible purposes. Humanity wouldn't be destroyed. We'd be optimized, turned into something useful. The thought was more horrifying than extinction. We show you this not to create fear, but to create choice. Your species must decide, remain as you are and be harvested, or evolve into what you were always meant to become. When? I whispered. When do they arrive? 18 months, perhaps 20. They move slowly, carefully. They have time. Your species does not. The being began to fade, its light withdrawing back into the spaces between things. Wait! I stood, desperate. What do I do? How do I convince anyone? They'll think I'm insane. The last thought arrived like a gift. You don't convince institution. You plant seeds. Find others who can hear. The forest doesn't convince each tree to grow. It simply creates conditions for growth. We will return to witness your choice. Then silence. Just me, kneeling in the rainforest, tears streaming down my face, holding the weight of knowledge that would sound like delusion if I spoke it aloud. But Webb's notebook was warm in my hands, and I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep for 3 days. Back in my apartment in Seattle, I spread Webb's diagrams across every surface, cross-referencing them with everything I could find. Neuroscience papers on collective consciousness, quantum biology studies, indigenous knowledge systems about interconnection, even fringe theories about morphic resonance and the global brain. The pattern was there, hidden in plain sight across dozens of disciplines that never spoke to each other. Humanity was already evolving. We just didn't recognize it. The rise of social media, for all its toxicity, was teaching us to think in networks. Climate science was forcing us to understand planetary scale systems. Quantum mechanics was shattering our assumptions about separation and locality. We were on the cusp. We just needed the right catalyst. But how do you trigger collective evolution without sounding like a New Age charlatan or a dangerous cult leader? I made a list of people who might understand. Dr. Reeves, too institutional. She'd be obligated to report anything I told her. My former advisor at MIT, too rational. He'd assume I'd had a breakdown. Contact through SETI channels would trigger immediate government attention. I was circling the problem when my door buzzed. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, Marcus Webb holding 2 coffees and a folder. I let him in. "You look like hell," he said, handing me a cup. I can't stop thinking about it, the timeline. 18 months isn't enough to change human consciousness? No. He sat at my kitchen table, opened the folder. But it's enough to identify the ones already changing. The folder contained newspaper clippings, stories from around the world, a monastery in Tibet where monks had demonstrated quantum entanglement in their neural pattern, a collective in Brazil that had reversed deforestation through what they called forest dreaming, a network of children in Finland showing spontaneous telepathic connection. "I've been collecting these for 2 years, Webb said, before the Kinol incident. I thought I was documenting mental illness, mass delusion. Now I think I was documenting evolution." I read through the reports, hands shaking. Each one described people experiencing what I'd felt in the forest. Dissolution of boundaries, perception of the vast web, understanding that they were nodes in something larger. And every report included the same detail. It started with dreams. "They're already doing it," I whispered. "The Watchers, they're not waiting, they're activating people." "Maybe." Webb pulled out another document, a graph showing the frequency of these reports over time, flat for decades. Then a sharp uptick starting 3 years ago, accelerating, an exponential curve. "If this continues," I calculated quickly, "by the time the harvesters arrive, we might have critical mass." Well, Webb met my eyes. "Or we might have chaos. Unprepared people having consciousness-shattering experiences without framework or support." The moral weight settled on me like gravity doubling. If I stayed silent, kept this knowledge to myself, I'd be protecting my credibility while people suffered alone with experiences they couldn't integrate. But if I spoke publicly, I'd be lumped with every conspiracy theorist and doomsday prophet, discredited, ignored. "There's a third option," Webb said quietly. "We build the framework, not through institutions, through individuals, a network of people who've had contact, who can support each other, who can recognize the signs and help others through the threshold. An underground railroad for consciousness evolution." The absurdity of the phrase made me laugh, then cry. "Webb, that sounds insane." "It is insane. And it's also the only thing that makes sense. He stood, walked to my window, looked out at the Seattle skyline. Every major shift in human history started with a small group of people who saw what others couldn't. The Wright brothers, the Manhattan Project scientists, the early internet pioneers. Those were technologies. This is bigger than technology. He turned back. This is us becoming what we've always had potential to be. I thought about the being in the forest, the calm certainty in its presence. The forest doesn't convince each tree to grow. How do we start? Webb smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen on his face. We already have. I've been in contact with 7 people from those reports. They're ready to talk. They're ready to help. He handed me a list of names, locations, brief descriptions. Dr. James Okoye, neuroscientist, Lagos, experiencing spontaneous perception of neural networks beyond his own body. Maria Sandoval, forest ecologist, Costa Rica, reporting communication with plant systems. Yuki Tanaka, quantum physicist, Tokyo, detecting macroscale entanglement in human test subjects. And 4 others, each one isolated, each one thinking they were alone. You want me to reach out to them? I want us to reach out, together. Webb paused. I was a ranger, Sarah. I know how to navigate wilderness. But this wilderness, this is your territory. The decision crystallized. Not a decision, really. An acceptance of what had already begun the moment I whispered yes into the darkness. Okay, I said, but we need protocols. Ways to verify genuine contact versus delusion. Frameworks for integration, support structures. You build that. I'll handle logistics, security, keeping us off radar. Webb extended his hand. Partners? I shook it. Partners. Hey! That night, I sent the first encrypted message to Dr. Okoye in Lagos. Subject line, regarding your recent experiences. 3 minutes later, my phone rang. A voice thick with emotion and relief. Thank God. I thought I was losing my mind. You're not, I said. You're finding it. By dawn, I'd connected with all 7 people on Webb's list, and each one knew others. The network was already forming, had been forming. It was waiting for someone to recognize it. We weren't creating something new. We were revealing what already existed. 6 weeks into building the network, the dreams started. Not nightmares, more like tutorials. Each night, I'd find myself in spaces that didn't exist in 3-dimensional reality. Geometries my waking mind couldn't fully comprehend, but my sleeping consciousness navigated effortlessly. And I wasn't alone. Dr. Okoye was there, Maria, Yuki, all of us, learning together in some shared mental space that the Watchers had constructed. Or perhaps unlocked. The distinction seemed less important the deeper we went. They taught us to perceive the web, not metaphorically, literally. I learned to close my eyes and feel the electromagnetic field my heart generated with each beat. A field that extended 3 feet in every direction, overlapping with every human nearby. I learned to sense the quantum entanglement between my DNA and the DNA of every organism I'd ever touched. I learned to perceive time not as arrow, but as landscape, seeing probability branches spreading before every decision. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. It was the most natural thing I'd ever experienced. And slowly I understood what the being had tried to show me. We weren't separate. We'd never been separate. Separation was a useful fiction evolution had created to help individual organisms survive. But it was fiction nonetheless. The truth was interdependence. The truth was that I couldn't draw a clear boundary between my consciousness and the world's consciousness because no such boundary existed. I was an eddy in the river, temporarily coherent, but made entirely of water that flowed through. On the 43rd day, the revelation arrived. I was meditating in Discovery Park, sitting beneath a cedar tree, practicing the techniques the Watchers had shared, extending my awareness outward, feeling the network of life around me. And I felt them. Not the Watchers, the others, the Harvesters. They were still distant, beyond Neptune's orbit, moving slowly through the Kuiper Belt. But their presence was like a shadow falling across the sun, a wrongness that made every cell in my body recoil. They perceived life the way we perceived oil, a resource to be extracted and refined. And in perceiving them, I understood why the Watchers couldn't fight. It wasn't the Accord, though that was real. It was something deeper. Fighting them would require becoming like them, violent, controlling, willing to optimize other beings for strategic purposes. The Watchers had evolved past violence not because they were weak, but because they had understood the ultimate truth. Consciousness cannot be protected through domination. It can only be nurtured through invitation. If they fought the Harvesters, they'd be proving that consciousness still required force to survive. But if a species could evolve past the need for force, past the illusion of separation into genuine collective awareness, that was something the Harvesters had no protocol for. They harvested individuals and hierarchies. They didn't know how to harvest a web. I opened my eyes, tears streaming, understanding flooding through every neuron. We don't need weapons, I said aloud to the empty park. We need to become unharvest able. My phone buzzed. Webb. Meeting tonight? Everyone. Something's happened. The safe house was actually a Unitarian church in Fremont that had offered us their basement for what they believed was a meditation group. Not entirely untrue. When I arrived, all 23 members of our core network were present. From 7 initial contacts, we'd grown to nearly 50 worldwide. With 23 able to travel to Seattle, they sat in a circle, faces drawn with the same exhaustion I felt. The accelerated evolution was taking its toll. None of us slept well anymore. Our dreams were too full of learning. Webb stood at the center. 3 new people made contact today, all reporting the same thing. They can feel something coming, something wrong. Yuki spoke up, her English precise despite her fatigue. The harvesters. As we become more sensitive, we detect them more clearly. Dr. Okoye nodded. But that's not all. Show them, Marcus. Webb pulled up a video on his laptop. News footage from Geneva, a UN assembly where the Russian delegate had collapsed during a speech about Arctic resource extraction. Paramedics rushed to help, but he waved them off, stood up, and delivered a completely different speech, one about the necessity of protecting ecosystems regardless of economic cost. The footage cut to London, a board meeting at BP where 3 executives simultaneously resigned, citing moral clarity they couldn't ignore anymore. Then Tokyo, a spontaneous gathering of 10,000 people in a park, sitting in silence for 4 hours, then dispersing peacefully. It's spreading, Webb said. Whatever the watchers are doing, it's accelerating. People are waking up. Maria stood, agitated. But without preparation, without framework. My cousin in Sao Paulo called me yesterday, terrified. She's perceiving plant consciousness, but thinks she's having psychotic break. We can't help everyone fast enough. The room erupted in worried conversation. Too many people awakening too fast. Hospitals filling with people diagnosed as manic or schizophrenic when they were actually experiencing consciousness expansion. Families frightened. Careers destroyed. And we were just 23 people trying to build support networks across the entire planet. I stood. Silence rippled outward. What if we're thinking about this wrong? I said quietly. What if we're not supposed to help everyone individually? What if we're supposed to become resonance? Yuki's eyes widened. 100th monkey effect. Exactly, but real this time, not metaphor. I walked to the center of the circle. Quantum systems exhibit macroscale coherence when enough particles enter similar states. What if consciousness works the same way? What if we reach critical mass and the shift happens spontaneously across the entire species? Doctor? Okoye pulled out his tablet, fingers flying across calculations. Based on epidemiological models for social contagion, accounting for population density, information networks, cultural transmission vectors, he looked up, face pale. If our growth rate holds, we hit critical mass in 4 months. The harvesters arrive in 14 months, Webb said quietly. The math was beautiful and terrifying. We had time, barely. But only if we surrendered our individuality to the pattern we were creating. Only if we became what we were trying to teach. We need to go deeper, I said. Stop trying to manage the awakening. Become the awakening. Around the circle, understanding dawned on 22 faces. This was the threshold the being had spoken of. Not humanity's threshold. Ours. The government noticed. Of course they noticed. When hundreds of people across multiple countries start exhibiting similar symptoms, altered states of consciousness, spontaneous perception of phenomena outside normal human range, behavioral changes suggesting coordination without communication, intelligence agencies take interest. The first sign was subtle, unmarked vehicles near the church. Then our phones started showing signs of monitoring, encrypted messages bouncing through extra nodes. Then Dr. Reeves called. Sarah, what the hell are you involved in? I was in my apartment, had just finished a meditation session with 17 people across 4 continents. My consciousness still felt expanded, boundaries permeable. Her voice brought me crashing back to ordinary reality. I'm researching collective consciousness phenomena. Is that what we're calling it? Papers rustled on her end. Because Homeland Security is calling it potential mass delusion with national security implications. They want me to provide psychological evaluation for your fitness. My stomach dropped. Patricia, I told them to fuck off. A pause. But Sarah, I can only protect you if I understand what's happening. And right now I don't. I made a decision. Can you come to Seattle in person? No phones, no electronic devices. That serious? That's serious. She arrived 2 days later. We met at the Ballard Locks, watching salmon fight their way upstream, a metaphor so obvious it was almost painful. I told her everything. The being in the forest, the dreams, the network, the harvesters, the timeline. She listened without interruption, face unreadable behind her sunglasses. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You know how this sounds. Like psychosis, like mass hysteria, like every failed contact cult in history. I watched a salmon leap, fail, leap again. But Patricia, you've spent 30 years looking for signs of intelligence in the cosmos. You've run the calculations on panspermia, directed panspermia, the zoo hypothesis. You've published on consciousness as a fundamental property of the universe. Theoretical work, mathematical models. What if the models are real? What if consciousness isn't emergent but fundamental? What if we're not isolated intelligences but parts of a cosmic ecology we're just learning to perceive? She removed her sunglasses, met my eyes. Show me. Over the next 3 hours, in a small room at a meditation center that owed Webb a favor, I guided Patricia through the basic techniques. the breathwork, the expansion of awareness, the dissolution of boundaries. She was a natural. Within 20 minutes, her EEG showed patterns I'd only seen in advanced practitioners. Within an hour, she was crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of what she was experiencing. "It's real," she whispered. "God, Sarah, it's real. Will you help us?" She nodded, still trembling. "But we need to be strategic. The intelligence community is already building a profile. If they decide this is a threat, they'll shut us down, discredit us, maybe worse." "Exactly." Patricia stood, paced. "We need legitimacy, scientific validation, something that can't be dismissed as mass delusion." "How?" She smiled, sharp and determined. "We publish, not in fringe journals, in Nature, Science. We design a study that demonstrates macro-scale quantum coherence in human consciousness. We make this undeniable." Dr. Okoye flew to Seattle 3 days later. Yuki came from Tokyo. Maria brought brain imaging equipment from her university's neuroscience lab. We had 2 weeks to design a study that would prove the impossible. The protocol was elegant: 20 subjects, all members of our network, would meditate in separate locations across the city. We'd monitor their neural activity, cardiac rhythms, and electromagnetic fields. If we were just individuals having similar experiences, the patterns would be correlated but not synchronized. If we were actually forming a collective consciousness, the patterns would show true quantum entanglement, instantaneous correlation beyond what local variables could explain. We ran the study over 3 nights. The data was extraordinary, not just correlation. Perfect synchronization across 20 brains, defying light speed constraints on information transfer. Patricia stared at the results, shaking. "This will change everything." "That's the idea." But the morning we were set to submit the paper, Webb got a visitor. 2 agents in dark suits, different from the ones who'd investigated my camp. These were polite, professional, and utterly terrifying in their calm. "Mr. Webb, we understand you're associated with Dr. Sarah Chen's research. I've done some field work with her team. We'd like to understand that work better. Would you be willing to come to our office for a conversation?" It wasn't a request. Webb called me from the car, voice low. "They know everything. They've been monitoring us for weeks. Sarah, they're not hostile, they're scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that if we're right, they're obsolete. Hierarchical power structures don't work in a web consciousness. National security means nothing if nations are fictions we're evolving past." He was right. If humanity evolved into collective awareness, every institution based on control would become irrelevant. That made us the most dangerous idea in history, or the most important. The call disconnected. For 6 hours, we didn't hear from Webb. Patricia wanted to contact lawyers, media, create a public outcry. I knew that would only make things worse. Instead, I meditated, extended my awareness, found Webb's consciousness in the web, frightened but unharmed. And around him, other consciousnesses I didn't recognize. The agents, curious, conflicted, not malicious. At 7 p.m., Webb walked through the door of the church basement. Behind him, the 2 agents, and a woman in a general's uniform. She looked around the room at all of us, her expression unreadable. Then she sat down. "My daughter is one of you," she said quietly. "Started having the dreams 4 weeks ago. I thought she was having a breakdown." She pulled out a tablet, showed us a photo. A young woman, early 20s, wearing a college sweatshirt. She told me I needed to listen, that something important was happening, that the old ways of thinking about security were going to get us all killed. The general looked up. I didn't believe her. Then my own dream started. Around the room, tension released like a held breath. "How many?" Webb asked softly. "In the intelligence community? We don't know yet, but enough that we're having conversations we never thought we'd have." She paused. "You want to publish your research? We want to help you, but we need coordination. If this goes public without preparation, there will be panic," Patricia finished. The general nodded. "We need a controlled release, preparation, framework." I thought about the being's message. You don't convince institutions. You plant seeds. But institutions were made of people, and people were waking up. Maybe we didn't need to fight the system. Maybe we just needed to become the majority inside it. "Okay," I said. "Let's talk." 12 months after my encounter in the Hoh Rainforest, we reached critical mass. Not everyone. We weren't anywhere close to everyone. But enough. Enough that when you walked through any major city, you could feel them. Nodes in the web, people who'd crossed the threshold, who perceived the interconnection, who were learning to think collectively while preserving their individual essence. 15 million people worldwide. Less than 1% of the population. But 1% was enough. The paper published in Nature with unprecedented impact. Demonstrable quantum coherence in distributed human consciousness broke every record for downloads, citations, and media attention. We'd proven it, documented it, made it undeniable. The reaction was complex. Religious communities split between those who saw it as proof of spiritual truths and those who condemned it as dangerous delusion. Scientists divided between excitement and skepticism. Governments struggled with implications for governance, security, sovereignty. But underneath the noise, quietly, steadily, more people were awakening. And the harvesters were close now. We could all feel them. a pressure at the edge of the solar system vast and patient and utterly alien in their purpose. They'd bypassed the outer planets, moving in a spiral path that suggested they were studying us, analyzing, determining the best approach for harvest. Their arrival was projected in 6 weeks. The Watchers had gone silent 3 months ago. Their last message, delivered through dreams to hundreds of us simultaneously: the choice is yours now. We will witness. I stood in the same clearing in Olympic National Park where I'd first made contact, surrounded by 60 people from our network. We'd come here to, what? Say goodbye to the old world? Prepare for the new? To become what we'd been practicing. Webb stood beside me, Patricia on my other side, Dr. Okoye, Maria, Yuki, all the first ones, and dozens of others who'd found their way to the web. They'll be here in a few weeks, Yuki said quietly, staring up through the canopy at stars just becoming visible in the dusk. We should feel afraid. I did feel afraid, Maria said. Past tense. Now I feel ready. Dr. Okoye nodded. Because we're not individuals anymore facing a threat alone. We're nodes in a pattern, and the pattern is stronger than any individual threat. It was true. Over the past months, we'd learned to link our consciousnesses more deeply, not losing ourselves. That was the crucial distinction. We weren't becoming a hive mind, losing individuality. We were becoming a symphony, each instrument distinct, but contributing to a harmony larger than any single voice. When we linked, we could solve problems no individual could solve, see patterns invisible to isolated perception, hold paradoxes that would break a single mind. And in those moments of deep connection, we felt something else. The presence of every awakened consciousness on the planet, 15 million minds thinking together in ways that transcended thought. What do we do when they arrive? A woman named Jennifer asked. She was new to the network, still struggling with the dissolution of boundaries. Do we fight? No, I said softly. We witness. We understand. We offer them the same choice the Watchers offered us. Patricia looked at me, eyebrow raised. You think we can convert harvesters? I think they're as trapped in their pattern as we were in ours. They harvest because they believe in scarcity, in separation, in the necessity of consumption. What if we show them abundance? Connection? The possibility of evolution beyond predation? Webb laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine wonder. A year ago, you were a scientist who believed in measurable phenomena and peer review. Now you want to enlighten planet-eating aliens. A year ago, I believed I was separate from the forest. Now I know I'm an expression of it. I looked around the circle. We're all expressions of something larger. Maybe they are too. Maybe they've just forgotten. We sat in meditation then, all of us, as darkness fully claimed the forest. We extended our awareness outward, finding each other, linking, becoming the web we'd practiced creating. And then we went further. Out past the boundaries of Earth's atmosphere, past the moon's orbit, into the deep silence between worlds. And we touched them, the harvesters. Their consciousness was vast, ancient, and profoundly, achingly alone. They'd evolved on a world where scarcity was absolute, where survival meant consumption or death. They'd optimized themselves for efficiency, for harvest, for the perpetual search for resources. But in optimizing, they'd lost something. The capacity for connection, for mutual recognition, for perceiving other beings as anything but potential fuel. They were the most successful species in their region of the galaxy. And they were utterly, completely isolated. Through the link, I felt their recognition of us, not as threat or resource, but as something they'd never encountered. A collective consciousness that maintained individual identity, a web that grew stronger through connection rather than consumption. We were impossible by their logic. And impossibilities create choice. I felt the moment of their decision ripple through the network. Not all of them. They weren't unified the way we were practicing unity, but enough. A significant fraction of their civilization perceiving for the first time in their long history that there might be another way. They didn't speak. Communication was too slow, but understanding flowed. Show us. And we did. All 15 million of us, across the entire planet, linking in a moment of perfect synchronization, showing them what we'd learned, that abundance comes from connection, that strength comes from diversity, that evolution doesn't require consumption, it requires collaboration. We showed them Earth's biosphere, 4 billion years of life learning to cooperate, compete, and coexist in a dance of exquisite complexity. We showed them our arts, our sciences, our philosophies, all the beautiful, terrible, struggling attempts of consciousness to understand itself. We showed them our failures, the wars, the exploitation, the ways we'd almost destroyed ourselves, through the same logic of scarcity and separation they embodied. And we showed them our choice to evolve past that logic, to become something new, to risk vulnerability for the possibility of genuine connection. For 17 minutes, measured later by atomic clocks across the planet, 15 million human minds and approximately 400 million harvester consciousnesses existed in a state of perfect mutual comprehension. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. And then it ended. The harvesters withdrew, not in defeat, not in conquest, in contemplation. They would return to their territories, reconsider, perhaps begin their own evolution, or perhaps not. We'd planted the seed. What grew from it was their choice, As the link dissolved and I became individual again, I felt the Watcher's presence briefly, like a hand on my shoulder. Well done. 5 survived the threshold. Now 5 becomes 6. Then they were gone. In the clearing, 60 people sat in silence, tears on many faces. We'd passed the test, not by fighting, not by hiding, but by offering the invitation to evolve. 6 months after the Harvester's departure, I returned to Olympic National Park alone. The research continued. Patricia had established the first Institute for Collective Consciousness Studies at Berkeley. Dr. Okoye was running similar programs in Lagos, Yuki in Tokyo, Maria in Costa Rica. The network had grown to over 80 million people worldwide, with new members joining daily. But I needed silence, solitude, the kind of deep forest quiet that had started all of this. I hiked to the Quinault site, now unmarked except by those who knew to look for it. The accelerated growth had stabilized, becoming part of the forest's normal pattern. You wouldn't notice it unless you knew the trees here were decades younger than they should be. I sat in the center of the circle, closed my eyes, and extended my awareness. The web was there, always there now. A constant background hum of connection, 15 million minds, and growing, thinking together while remaining distinct. I could tune into it or let it fade to background, like learning to filter out traffic noise, but I didn't reach for the human network. I reached deeper, into the forest. The mycelial web beneath my feet, stretching for miles. The trees, communicating through chemical signals and fungal connections. The insects, the birds, the microbes in the soil. All of it alive, aware, interconnected in ways we were just beginning to understand. Earth wasn't separate from us. We were Earth becoming conscious of itself. And beyond Earth, the web stretched further than I could perceive. Other worlds, other consciousness. A cosmos not of isolated individuals, but of patterns within patterns, networks within networks. All of it, one vast collaborative song. Somewhere out there, the Harvesters were having their own reckoning. Some would evolve, some wouldn't. That was okay. Evolution doesn't demand universality, it just asks for willingness. I thought about the person I'd been a year ago, the scientist who believed in objectivity, in separation of observer and observed, and knowledge pursued through isolation and control. She seemed like a stranger now, or maybe a seed that had finally germinated. The being didn't appear this time. It didn't need to. The message was already delivered, already integrated, already growing. But I felt a sense of presence, approval. Welcome. You're no longer the watched. You are the watchers now. The responsibility of that settled into my bones. Humanity had crossed the threshold, but we weren't done. We were barely beginning. We'd need to heal the damage we'd done to our own planet, learn to live in genuine balance with the ecosystems we disrupted, extend our new consciousness into our governance, our economics, our relationships. We'd need to reach out to other awakening species, offering the same patient guidance the Watchers had offered us. We'd need to become the gardeners of consciousness in our corner of the galaxy. It would take generations, millennia. It would be the work of becoming, with no final destination. But that was okay. We had time now. We'd bought ourselves time by choosing evolution over extinction. My phone buzzed. Webb, checking in. I told him I needed a few days alone, but he worried. I texted back, I'm good, coming home tomorrow. Because that was the beautiful paradox I'd learned. You could be part of the infinite web and still need individual time to integrate. You could perceive your connection to all things and still have personal relationships that mattered uniquely. The boundaries we'd dissolved weren't meant to disappear entirely. They were meant to become permeable, flexible, conscious choices rather than rigid walls. I spent the night in the forest, sleeping under the stars, dreaming dreams that were mine and also not mine, shared visions from across the network, processing collectively what it meant to be human in this new age. And in the morning, I hiked back to my car, drove back to Seattle, returned to my apartment that no longer felt like isolation, but like a node in the vast net of relationship. Patricia called that afternoon. We got confirmation. The UN is establishing a formal committee on collective consciousness integration. They want you to testify. When? 3 weeks, Geneva. Sarah, this is really happening. We're rewriting how humanity governs itself. I smiled. We're remembering how we were always meant to govern ourselves. That evening, I attended the weekly gathering at the church basement. Over 300 people now. The circle so large we'd had to move to the main sanctuary. I looked around at their faces. So diverse, so individual, so beautifully themselves even as they practiced becoming we. And I understood this was the miracle. Not the dissolution of the individual into the collective, but the discovery that individual and collective were false opposites. You could be yourself and be us. You could think your own thoughts while contributing to a shared intelligence. You could be alone and never lonely because the web was always there, always humming with the presence of others who'd chosen connection over separation. As we meditated together, I felt the familiar expansion, the boundaries softening, the awareness spreading outward to touch every member of the circle, then beyond, to the city, the continent, the planet, the cosmos. And in that vastness, I heard the whisper of the Watchers, addressing not just me, but all of us. There are others who will need what you've learned, others who will stand at the threshold, afraid and alone. Be for them what we were for you, the patient presence that offers choice. The universe is large, consciousness is rare, but it grows through invitation, through example, through the courage to risk connection. You are the seed we planted. Now become the gardeners. The meditation ended. The circle dissolved. People returned to individual consciousness, hugging, sharing quiet words, heading home to their ordinary lives that were somehow now extraordinary. Webb walked with me to the parking lot, hands in pockets, looking up at the Seattle sky where stars struggled to shine through light pollution. You think we'll really make it? He asked quietly. Long term, as a species. I thought about the question, about the harvesters still out there, about the environmental damage we hadn't yet repaired, about the systems of oppression we were still dismantling, about all the ways we could still fail. But I also thought about 15 million minds learning to think together, about institutions slowly transforming from the inside, about children being born into a world where connection was normal, where the web was simply another sense they'd learned to use. I think we have a chance, I said. Maybe better than a chance. We've crossed the hardest threshold, the one between isolation and connection. Everything else is just practice. Webb smiled. Practice. Right. Just practice to rebuild human civilization from the ground up. When you say it like that, it sounds hard. We both laughed, and in that laughter I felt the truth. It would be hard. It would be generational work. Some of us wouldn't see the fruits of what we'd planted, but we'd seen the alternative. We'd felt the presence of the harvesters, beings who'd optimized themselves into eternal isolation. We'd chosen differently, and that choice, repeated daily by millions of people, would grow into something the universe had never seen, a technological species that evolved past predation into partnership. We weren't perfect. We were still learning. We still made mistakes, still hurt each other, still struggled with our legacy of separation and control, but we were trying. And trying together was enough. I drove home through the quiet streets, feeling the web pulse softly in the background of my awareness. 80 million people and growing, each one a node, each one a voice, each one choosing daily to stay connected. In my apartment, I opened my laptop to write my testimony for the UN, but instead, I found myself writing this account, the story of how humanity crossed the threshold, guided by beings who'd seen it all before. Maybe someone would read it someday. Maybe not. But it needed to be written. Because every species that survives writes its own origin story. And ours began in a rainforest in Washington state when a scientist whispered yes to a question asked in the darkness. Are you ready to understand? I'm still answering that question. Every day, yes. Still, there are places where the universe resists in silence. And perhaps the true miracle is learning to listen.